There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has learned to read a balance sheet with the same fluency that others read a novel or a newspaper. A quiet that is not the peaceful silence of contentment, but rather the hushed stillness of a room from which the possibility of surprise has been carefully and systematically removed. You may recognize this quiet in yourself if you have ever found yourself sitting alone after a social gathering, not basking in the warmth of the connections that were made or the conversations that were shared, but instead running a mental calculation of the cost of the wine that was consumed, the depreciation on the vehicle that transported you to and from the event, and the opportunity cost of the 4 hours that were not spent on some marginally productive activity that might have advanced your financial position by an infinitesimal increment. You may recognize it in the peculiar sensation of watching a friend announce an extravagant vacation or a spontaneous purchase and feeling not the reflexive joy that the friendship would seem to warrant, but rather a quiet, almost involuntary assessment of the probable impact of that expenditure on their long-term net worth, followed by a subtle but unmistakable distancing from the carefree pleasure that they appear to be experiencing. And you may recognize it most acutely in the moments when you attempt to explain to someone who does not share your particular cast of mind why you are not joining them for an expensive dinner, or why you are driving a car that has long since passed the point of optimal trade-in value. And you find yourself reaching for language that will make sense of your choices without revealing the full, bleak architecture of compound interest tables and Monte Carlo simulations, and the relentless arithmetic of time that underlies every financial decision you have made since you first understood what a dollar, properly deployed, could become if left undisturbed for 30 years. This is the psychological burden of seeing the ledger, and it is a burden that correlates in ways that are only beginning to be understood by researchers in the fields of behavioral economics and financial psychology, with a particular strain of melancholy that is not easily shaken and not easily explained to those who have never learned to see the world through the lens of amortization schedules and marginal tax rates. The core concept that we are examining here is the idea that financial literacy, the ability to understand and apply the principles of sound money management, is not an unalloyed good that delivers its benefits without exacting a corresponding cost from the psyche of the person who possesses it. The conventional narrative, propagated by the financial education industry and by a culture that venerates the prudent steward and the disciplined saver, holds that becoming good with money is a purely positive transformation, a journey from the darkness of ignorance and anxiety into the light of control and security, and that the only people who suffer from financial knowledge are those who have failed to acquire enough of it. But this narrative, like many of the stories that a culture tells itself about the nature of the good life, conceals a more complicated and more uncomfortable truth, which is that the acquisition of financial knowledge changes the way a person experiences the world in ways that are not always pleasant and not always compatible with the spontaneous enjoyment of life's ordinary pleasures. To see the ledger clearly is to see the cost of everything, and to see the cost of everything is to be reminded, constantly and unavoidably, of the trade-offs that are being made with every decision and every expenditure and every hour of time that is not being converted into productive output. This constant awareness of trade-offs, while invaluable for the purpose of building and preserving wealth, exacts a toll on the capacity for uncalculated joy, for the kind of expenditure that is made not because it makes mathematical sense, but because it makes the heart feel something that cannot be captured in a spreadsheet cell. And over time, the accumulation of these small renunciations and deferred gratifications can settle into the soul as a low-grade but persistent melancholy, a sense that one is always watching life from behind the glass of a financial statement rather than living it from within. The psychological explanation for why seeing the ledger produces this particular form of melancholy requires us to understand two distinct but related phenomena that operate in the mind of the financially literate person, one cognitive and one emotional, and that interact with each other in ways that amplify their individual effects. The cognitive phenomenon is what we might call the monetization of experience, the gradual and often unconscious process by which every activity, every object, and every relationship is assigned a dollar value and evaluated against the alternative uses to which that dollar value could have been put. This is not a pathology, but rather a direct and logical extension of the core principle of economics, which is that resources are scarce and that every choice involves an opportunity cost, the value of the next best alternative that is foregone when a decision is made. The financially literate person has internalized this principle so thoroughly that it operates automatically and beneath the level of conscious deliberation, scanning the environment for expenditures and calculating with a speed and precision that would be the envy of any accounting department the true cost of each experience when measured against the compound growth that the same dollars could have achieved if invested in a diversified portfolio of low-cost index funds over a multi-decade time horizon. A $100 dinner viewed through this lens is not merely $100, but rather the future value of that $100 after 30 years of compounding at 7%, which is approximately $760, a sum that is large enough to give even the most financially secure person a moment of pause before ordering the second glass of wine. This monetization of experience, while protective of the balance sheet, gradually leaches the color out of lived experience, transforming moments of pleasure into occasions for mental arithmetic and replacing the simple joy of the present with the anxious calculation of the future. The emotional phenomenon that accompanies and amplifies this cognitive monetization is what researchers in the field of financial therapy have begun to call financial hypervigilance, a state of persistent, low-level arousal of the nervous system's threat detection circuitry that is triggered by the awareness of all the things that could go wrong with even the most carefully constructed financial plan. The financially literate person knows, with a level of detail that the financially naive person cannot access and therefore cannot be troubled by, the precise statistical probabilities of a market crash, a prolonged period of unemployment, a major medical expense, a long-term care need, a sequence of returns disaster, and the dozens of other financial risks that lurk in the tail of the probability distribution. This knowledge, while essential for prudent planning, is also a form of chronic stress, because the brain's threat detection system was not designed to distinguish between the immediate physical danger of a predator and the abstract probabilistic danger of a bear market. And it responds to both with the same cascade of stress hormones that prepare the body for fight or flight. The financially literate person lives, in a very real neurochemical sense, in a state of mild but constant alert, scanning the horizon for threats to the portfolio and the plan. And this state of alert, sustained over years and decades, has measurable effects on mood, on sleep quality, and on the capacity for the kind of relaxed, present-moment awareness that is the foundation of emotional well-being. The irony, and it is a bitter one, is that the very knowledge and discipline that protect a person from the acute financial anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck also condemn that person to a chronic, low-grade anxiety about the preservation of what has been accumulated, and the relief from one form of financial stress is purchased at the price of another. The mathematical breakdown of this phenomenon, while not as cleanly quantifiable as the compound interest calculations that produce it, can be approached through the lens of what economists call the marginal utility of wealth, a concept that describes the additional satisfaction or well-being that is derived from an additional unit of wealth. The standard assumption in classical economics is that the marginal utility of wealth is positive but diminishing, meaning that each additional dollar provides some additional satisfaction but less than the dollar that preceded it, a pattern that is consistent with the observed behavior of most people and that forms the basis for the ubiquitous advice to save and invest rather than to consume immediately. But what this standard model fails to account for is the possibility that at some point, for some people, the marginal utility of wealth may become negative, that the additional financial security purchased by an additional dollar of savings may be outweighed by the psychological cost of the vigilance, the renunciation, and the monetization of experience that were required to accumulate that dollar. This is not a possibility that is easily accommodated within the framework of traditional economics, which treats preferences as fixed and utility as a simple function of consumption. But it is a possibility that anyone who has spent time in the company of the truly financially disciplined will recognize as real. The person who has optimized every aspect of their financial life, who has maximized their tax-advantage contributions and minimized their investment expenses and eliminated every unnecessary recurring charge from their monthly statements, often arrives at a place of impressive numerical security, accompanied by a quiet but unmistakable sense of loss, a feeling that something vital and human has been traded away in exchange for a number on a screen that continues to grow, but that provides, beyond a certain point, no additional increment of genuine peace or joy. The mathematics of this trade-off are not easily captured in a spreadsheet because the variables on the non-financial side of the ledger, the experiences foregone, the spontaneity suppressed, the relationship strained by a constant orientation toward the future rather than the present, are not denominated in dollars and cannot be aggregated into a tidy sum, but they are real nonetheless, and they accumulate over time into a form of wealth depletion that no brokerage statement will ever reflect. The systemic zoom-out reveals that this correlation between financial competence and melancholy is not merely an individual psychological quirk, but rather a predictable and perhaps even intended feature of an economic system that depends, for its continued expansion, on the willingness of a significant portion of the population to defer gratification, to accumulate capital, and to provide the patient, long-term funding that lubricates the machinery of investment and growth. The entire edifice of modern capitalism rests upon the shoulders of the savers, the people who consume less than they produce and who direct the surplus into the financial markets that allocate capital to productive enterprises. And this edifice could not stand if the majority of the population were to adopt the carefree, present-oriented consumption patterns that the culture simultaneously celebrates in its advertising and its entertainment. The system needs a certain number of people to be good with money, to see the ledger clearly, and to make the quiet, unglamorous sacrifices that keep the great engine of capital formation running. And it is perhaps not a coincidence that the culture provides so few resources for helping those people navigate the psychological consequences of the role they have been assigned. The financial advice industry, which is the primary institutional voice speaking to the financially literate, is almost entirely silent on the question of how to enjoy the money that has been saved, how to transition from the accumulation phase to the enjoyment phase without triggering the anxiety and guilt that have been carefully cultivated as the guardians of the accumulation phase, and how to reconcile the mathematical logic of compound interest with the emotional logic of a finite human life. The industry's silence on these questions is not necessarily malicious, but it is systematic. And it leaves the financially literate to navigate the psychological territory of their competence alone, without maps or guides or even the acknowledgement that the territory exists, the identity shift that is required to mitigate the melancholy of seeing. The ledger is not a shift away from financial competence, because the abandonment of prudence is not a solution to its psychological costs, but merely an exchange of one form of distress for another. And the distress of financial precarity is, for most people, far more acute and far more damaging than the distress of financial hypervigilance. The identity shift is, instead, a conscious and deliberate expansion of the definition of wealth to include not only the financial assets that appear on the balance sheet, but also the experiential assets that appear nowhere in the accounting, but that constitute the actual substance of a life lived. This expansion requires the financially literate person to develop a second ledger, a parallel accounting system that tracks not the dollars accumulated and deployed, but the experiences embraced, the relationships nurtured, the moments of uncalculated joy that were permitted to occur without first being subjected to a cost-benefit analysis, and the memories that will constitute the true inheritance of the older self who will one day look back on the choices that were made. This second ledger is not a denial of the first ledger, but a complement to it, a recognition that the purpose of the financial assets is to fund the experiential assets, and that a portfolio that grows indefinitely while the life it was meant to support withers from neglect is not a success, but a failure of the most fundamental kind. The identity shift also involves a deliberate and practiced tolerance for what the financially literate mind perceives as waste or inefficiency, an acceptance that some expenditures will not be optimal when measured against the compound growth that they forego, and that this is not merely acceptable, but necessary for the preservation of the very humanity that the financial assets were accumulated to serve. A dinner with friends that costs more than it should and that yields no quantifiable return on investment is not a mistake to be avoided, but a dividend to be collected. A withdrawal from the experiential account that justifies the years of discipline that made the dinner possible. The calm closing of this inquiry is not a prescription for abandoning the ledger or for embracing a carefree consumption that ignores the real and important constraints of a finite financial life. The calm closing is an invitation to hold the ledger with a lighter grip, to recognize that financial competence is a tool and not an identity, and to remember that the purpose of the tool is to enable a life that is rich in the dimensions that cannot be entered into a spreadsheet cell. The melancholy that correlates with being good with money is real, and it is earned, a natural consequence of seeing clearly the trade-offs that others are able to ignore. But it is not an inescapable sentence. It can be acknowledged, honored for the prudence that it represents, and then set aside in the moments when the purpose of the prudence, the enjoyment of the finite, precious, and unrepeatable experience of being alive, calls for a different kind of calculation. The ledger will still be there tomorrow, with its reassuring columns of numbers and its silent testimony to the discipline of years. But tonight, there is a dinner with friends, or a concert, or a trip to a place you have always wanted to see, and the cost of these things, measured in foregone future dollars, is the price of admission to a life that is actually lived rather than merely optimized. The financially literate person who learns to pay this price without flinching, who learns to move between the world of the ledger and the world of uncalculated experience with grace and intention, has not abandoned their competence but has fulfilled it, has completed the arc from accumulation to enjoyment. That is the whole point of the exercise. The melancholy may never fully dissipate, because the knowledge of what each dollar could have become can never be fully unknown, but it can be transformed from a burden into a companion, a quiet voice that offers its counsel and is then thanked and gently dismissed, leaving space for the other voices, the ones that speak not of compound interest and safe withdrawal rates, but of beauty and connection and the strange, brief, luminous gift of being here at all.